Chief Justice Elena Grant tapped her fingers lightly on the armrest of her first-class seat, observing passengers as they navigated the narrow airplane aisle. This routine had become second nature to her. She could probably make her way through an airport blindfolded. The familiar scent of recirculated air, mixed with the faint aroma of leather upholstery, felt oddly comforting. This was her element, her regular Thursday morning flight to yet another conference or court hearing. Elena adjusted her tailored designer dress, a stunning piece her best friend Camille had insisted on gifting her for her birthday last month. "You've got to show them what a Supreme Court justice looks like in 2025, Camille had teased with a laugh. The memory made Elena smile as she settled deeper into her seat. The sounds of slamming overhead compartments and lively chatter filled the cabin. A harried businessman in an ill-fitting suit wrestled with his oversized carry-on, while a young mother tried to soothe her crying baby a few rows ahead. Elena took out her tablet, her mind already jumping to the pile of case briefs awaiting her attention. Tomorrow, she'd be presiding over a pivotal environmental hearing, and preparation was crucial. Flight attendants moved through the cabin with practiced efficiency, their polished smiles and rehearsed instructions making the process seem effortless. Elena had always admired their professionalism, how they handled everything from minor complaints to major crises with such grace. Over the years, she'd seen it all: medical emergencies, irate passengers, even a mid-flight marriage proposal. This flight, however, seemed routine enough. Pulling out a thick folder from her briefcase, Elena reviewed the details of her next case, a small town battling a corporation over hazardous waste disposal. The intricate legal language felt familiar and grounding. She had a knack for turning any place, whether an airport lounge or a park bench, into her temporary office. The safety demonstration began, but Elena only half listened, her focus drifting back to the case. She had a soft spot for cases like this, ones that championed the underdog and gave a voice to communities often silenced by powerful interests. Around her, passengers were already engrossed in their phones or beginning to doze off, despite the plane still being on the tarmac. Across the aisle, a young man offered a polite smile before returning to his laptop. The rhythm of first-class travel was predictable, a delicate dance of polite acknowledgments and maintaining personal space. Elena had just immersed herself back into the dense legal briefs when an odd sensation pulled her attention upward. Her instincts, owned from years on the bench, told her something was off. A flight attendant was making her way down the aisle, checking seat belts and luggage, but her gaze lingered a little too long on Elena. It wasn't the usual, professional once-over. There was something else in that look, something sharp and uneasy that made Elena's stomach tighten. Trying to dismiss the discomfort, Elena reminded herself she had faced prejudice before, both blatant and subtle. Years of navigating biases had taught her to distinguish between genuine discrimination and her own heightened awareness. But this felt different, calculated, almost. The attendant's gaze lingered again, her expression hard to decipher, but its effect was unmistakable. It chipped away momentarily at Elena's carefully constructed armor. Taking a deep breath, she tried to refocus on her work. The plane began to taxi, its engines rumbling steadily beneath her. Elena allowed the familiar vibrations to calm her nerves. She reminded herself not to jump to conclusions and to give people the benefit of the doubt. There were more important things to focus on than one flight attendant's apparent unease. Outside the window, the setting sun bathed the horizon in vivid hues of orange and pink, a breathtaking view that Elena couldn't help but steal glances at between paragraphs of her briefs. Flying always gave her a sense of perspective. From this high up, the world felt smaller, its problems more manageable, as if gravity itself had loosened its grip. Around her, the other passengers had settled into their routines. Some were typing away on laptops. Others had already donned eye masks and fallen asleep. The steady hum of the engines, punctuated by the occasional ding of a service button, created a comforting background rhythm. Elena returned to her tablet, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something about this flight was different. And not in a good way. The familiar ding of the service button blended with the soft hum of the engines, a comforting symphony of air travel. Justice Elena Grant reached for her water bottle, but her motion paused as she noticed the flight attendant approaching her row. This time, there was no mistaking the look. The woman's gaze shifted from Elena's face to her dress and finally to her seat number. There was a deliberate scrutiny in her eyes, one that made Elena's chest tighten. She'd encountered this look before, in exclusive boutiques, at private clubs, and high-end restaurants. It was the kind of look that silently declared, "You don't belong here." Straightening her posture, Elena reflexively touched her neck where her reading glasses usually hung on a delicate chain, a comforting habit she'd picked up from her mentor, the first black female judge she'd ever met. The glasses weren't there today, but the gesture helped steady her nerves. The cabin lights dimmed as the plane reached cruising altitude, casting everything in a soft glow. Elena tried to refocus on her work, but her concentration had been fractured. The words on her tablet blurred as her thoughts wandered to similar moments from her past. She recalled her first day as a Chief Justice, the stares of disbelief when she walked into the courtroom. Some had mistaken her for a clerk, even in her robes. She had faced those situations with grace, allowing her work to do the talking. Yet here, confined in a metal tube at 35,000 feet, the challenge felt different, harder to brush off. The flight attendant passed by again, this time brushing unnecessarily close to Elena's arm despite the wide aisle. It was subtle, so minor that many would dismiss it as accidental. But Elena knew better. Years of courtroom experience had sharpened her ability to detect intent in even the smallest gestures. She glanced around, wondering if anyone else had noticed. Most passengers were absorbed in their own bubbles, watching movies, scrolling on phones, or dozing off. However, an elderly man across the aisle caught her eye and gave her a subtle nod, a quiet acknowledgement that she wasn't imagining things. Elena checked the time on her phone. 3 more hours to go. She'd endured longer trials and tougher situations, she reminded herself. This was just another test of her patience and professionalism. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory. "They can only make you feel small if you let them, baby." The scent of dinner being prepared wafted through the cabin, the clinking of glasses and soft murmurs signaling the start of the meal service. Elena tensed slightly, wondering how the next interaction with the attendant would unfold. This wasn't how she'd envisioned her flight. She had hoped to finish reviewing at least 2 case files and draft notes for tomorrow's hearing. Instead, she found herself strategizing how to navigate an increasingly uncomfortable situation, all while preserving her dignity. The dinner cart rolled toward her row, pushed by the same flight attendant. The name tag on her crisp uniform read Cheryl. The light caught it as she leaned over to serve the passenger across the aisle, her movements precise and professional. When Cheryl turned to Elena, however, her practiced smile turned stiff, almost plastic. "Your dinner choice?" Cheryl asked, her tone carrying an unmistakable edge that hadn't been present with the other passengers. "The chicken, please," Elena replied, keeping her voice calm and polite. Years of dealing with subtle prejudice had taught her that maintaining composure was often the most effective response. Cheryl placed the tray on Elena's table with a bit too much force, causing the water glass to tip precariously close to the rim. "That's quite a dress," Cheryl remarked, her voice laced with thinly veiled suspicion. "Must have cost a fortune." The implication behind her words was clear. Someone like Elena shouldn't be able to afford such luxury. Elena inhaled deeply before responding. "It was a gift, actually," she said evenly. She owed Cheryl no explanation, but she'd learned that sometimes the simplest responses were the most disarming. Cheryl raised an eyebrow. "Oh, a gift. How nice for you," she said, her words dripping with skepticism. She fumbled with the items on her cart before turning back abruptly. "I'll need to see your boarding pass again. Just routine checking," she added with a practiced smile that didn't reach her eyes. Elena's movements were deliberate and calm as she reached for her purse. She'd flown enough to know this wasn't routine. Boarding passes were checked before takeoff, and no one else in first class had been asked for this so-called routine check. As she handed over her pass, Elena couldn't help but notice the subtle shift in the atmosphere. Passengers nearby, previously immersed in their own worlds, were now watching, some curious, others visibly uncomfortable with what they were witnessing. The businessman sitting beside Justice Elena Grant glanced up from his laptop, his brow furrowing as he became aware of the uncomfortable scene unfolding next to him. His fingers paused mid-typing, and his frown deepened. Around them, other passengers were beginning to notice as well, the serene bubble of first-class travel quietly punctured by an escalating tension. "Here you go," Elena said, extending her boarding pass toward Cheryl, the flight attendant. Cheryl accepted it with the tips of her fingers, handling it as if it might disintegrate. She examined it with exaggerated scrutiny, her narrowed eyes lingering on the details. When her gaze landed on the line reading government rate, her lips pressed into a thin, skeptical line. "Government rate," Cheryl repeated, her voice edged with a faint challenge. "And what exactly do you do for the government?" The question hung in the air, weighted with implication. It was clear Cheryl couldn't imagine Elena holding a position significant enough to warrant sitting in first class. A familiar heaviness settled in Elena's chest. She'd encountered this kind of questioning countless times before, during law school, in courtrooms, even at high-end restaurants. The unspoken demand to justify her presence in spaces others assumed weren't meant for her was exhausting. Elena's pulse quickened, not out of fear, but from a weariness that ran deep. "I work in the judicial system," she said simply, her voice measured. She chose her words carefully. Revealing her position as Chief Justice often led to either overly contrite apologies or outright disbelief, neither of which she had the energy for. Cheryl handed the boarding pass back, her movements deliberate and slow, as if still searching for some reason to doubt it. "Well, everything seems to be in order," she said, her tone making it clear she believed the opposite. Her eyes dropped again to Elena's dress. "Although," she added, her voice sharp, "that dress really isn't appropriate for air travel. It's taking up quite a bit of space in the aisle." Elena glanced down at her perfectly tailored sheath dress. It was modest, elegant, and ended neatly just above her knees. It wasn't obstructing anything, not the aisle, not her neighbor's space. The accusation was absurd, and a few passengers exchanged glances, their expressions registering disbelief. An older woman across the aisle shook her head, a subtle gesture of disapproval at Cheryl's behavior. Elena smoothed her napkin across her lap, the small act helping her maintain her composure. "I appreciate your concern," she replied quietly, "but I assure you my clothing isn't causing any obstruction." She picked up her fork, signaling that the conversation, at least on her end, was over. But Cheryl lingered. Adjusting items on her cart that didn't need adjusting, she leaned slightly closer. "You know," she said, her voice lowered, but still loud enough for nearby passengers to hear, "first class has certain standards. Not everyone understands that." The implication hit Elena like a physical blow. She placed her fork down with a deliberate clink against her plate. The once appetizing chicken dinner before her now felt impossible to eat. The air in the cabin grew heavier, the confined space suddenly feeling suffocating. Elena was acutely aware of the other passengers around her, some pretending not to notice, others openly watching the exchange. The businessman beside her shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his frown deepening. Cheryl remained by her cart, straightening perfectly aligned items with mechanical precision. Her presence felt less like an offer of service and more like a challenge, a quiet dare for Elena to respond, to somehow confirm the prejudiced assumptions Cheryl seemed determined to project onto her. As Cheryl's wedding ring caught the dim cabin light, Elena's mind wandered briefly. What was Cheryl's story? What experiences had shaped her into someone who could so casually and callously demean another person? "Is there something else you need?" Elena finally asked, her voice soft yet steady, meeting Cheryl's gaze with calm resolve. It was the same tone she used in her courtroom when someone pushed boundaries they shouldn't. Cheryl flushed slightly, her confidence faltering. "No," she replied, her voice defensive. "Nothing else, just doing my job." She emphasized the word job in a way that suggested it gave her the authority to treat passengers however she pleased, making sure everyone belongs where they're sitting. The words stung, their intent unmistakable. A young woman 2 rows ahead turned in her seat, no longer pretending to ignore the scene. Her expression was a mix of shock and sympathy. Elena caught her eye and offered a small, reassuring smile. This wasn't her first encounter with prejudice, and sadly, it wouldn't be her last. The businessman beside Elena cleared his throat. "Excuse me," he said to Cheryl, his tone firm and laced with authority. "I think we're all set here." His intervention added a new layer of complexity. Elena felt a wave of gratitude tinged with frustration. While she appreciated his support, she wished it hadn't been necessary. Cheryl's lips tightened into a thin line, her earlier confidence slipping further. She gave one last pointed look at Elena's dress before pushing her cart forward. But as she moved past, she deliberately bumped the edge of the cart against Elena's armrest, causing water from her glass to spill onto the dress's delicate fabric. "Oh, I'm so sorry," Cheryl said, her voice void of any genuine remorse. "These aisles can be so narrow." "Sorry," Cheryl muttered, her tone devoid of any sincerity. She didn't offer a napkin or make any move to assist, instead briskly pushing her cart forward. "These aisles can be so narrow," she added dismissively, leaving Justice Elena Grant to contend with the spreading water stain on her dress. The older woman across the aisle immediately reached into her purse and produced a small pack of tissues. "Here, dear," she said softly, passing them to Elena. "Some people just can't help showing their true colors, can they?" Elena accepted the tissues with a grateful nod, carefully dabbing at the wet fabric. The water stain would dry, the dress could be cleaned, but the sting of the interaction lingered. Her thoughts turned to the young black women she'd mentored over the years, those who faced similar treatment without the armor of credentials or position to shield them. The cabin lights dimmed, signaling the shift to evening mode. Elena looked out the window at the darkening sky, her reflection faintly visible against the clouds. The woman staring back at her appeared composed and dignified, but the weight of the battle was evident in her eyes. She picked up her tablet, attempting to refocus on the environmental case she was reviewing. The case was about a community fighting against corporate exploitation, a cause that usually filled her with purpose. But tonight, the words blurred as her mind wandered back to her own fight, now unfolding at 35,000 feet. Her gaze dropped to the water stain on her dress, watching how it slowly spread. In her courtroom, she was Justice Grant, a commanding presence whose mere arrival demanded respect. But here, in the confined space of the airplane, she was just another passenger subjected to the ugly realities of prejudice. Elena unlocked her phone and scrolled aimlessly through emails, her inbox full of the usual assortment of clerical updates, hearing schedules, and invitations to speak at events. These once important communications felt distant and surreal in the context of the pressurized cabin, where her authority seemed to vanish. The young woman who had turned around earlier caught Elena's eye again. She mouthed, "Are you okay?" Elena offered a small nod, touched by the stranger's concern. It reminded her of her early days in law school, when quiet acts of solidarity from classmates had helped her through moments of isolation and doubt. Cheryl passed by again, this time ignoring Elena completely. But the pointed avoidance felt just as hostile as the earlier confrontation. The sound of Cheryl's heels clicking sharply against the floor seemed to echo the message, "You don't belong here." Elena's hand instinctively went to her neck, searching for the reading glasses that weren't there. Her mentor, Justice Marilyn, the first black woman on the bench in her state, had always told her to keep something close that grounded her during trying moments. "Sometimes just touching something familiar helps you remember who you are," Marilyn had said. Right now, Elena wished she had her glasses, her judicial robe, or anything that could anchor her in this moment. The businessman seated next to her leaned slightly toward her, breaking the silence. "That was completely inappropriate," he said quietly. "You should report her." Elena considered his words, knowing full well that she had the power to make Cheryl's life very difficult if she chose to file a complaint. But would it solve anything? Would it address the underlying bias that had fueled this entire exchange? "Thank you," Elena replied softly, her tone carrying both gratitude and resignation. But sometimes these situations are more complicated than they appear. Her mind drifted to the countless times she'd faced similar treatment, in restaurants, at conferences, even at prestigious events, before people realized her status. Each time she'd weighed the cost of speaking up against the toll it would take on her spirit. The plane hit a patch of turbulence, and the cabin shuddered slightly. Passengers gripped their drinks as a few exchanged nervous glances. The jolts mirrored Elena's internal state, unsettled, unstable, and searching for solid ground. Her thoughts returned to her last ruling, handed down just a week ago. It had been a case about workplace discrimination, one where she'd spent hours in her chambers meticulously analyzing evidence and weighing the potential societal impact of her decision. And now, here she was, experiencing firsthand the very kind of injustice she'd been working to dismantle from the bench. The irony was not lost on her. A Chief Justice feeling powerless in the face of casual discrimination. Her years of education, her esteemed position, and her carefully cultivated professional demeanor had not been enough to shield her from this moment. The cabin lights flickered briefly, snapping Elena out of her thoughts. She glanced at the passengers around her, some asleep, others engrossed in their screens or conversations. A young child a few rows ahead whispered loudly to their parent, asking why the lady looked upset. Elena adjusted her tablet on the tray table, forcing herself to focus. But the weight of the evening remained heavy, a reminder of the work still left to be done, not just in courtrooms but in spaces as mundane as this airplane cabin. Some passengers were asleep, others watched movies or tapped away at their laptops. Around Justice Elena Grant, life continued as though nothing unusual had happened. Just ordinary people going about their ordinary routines. Meanwhile, she sat wrestling with a choice. Should she assert her identity or preserve her privacy? Elena opened her briefcase again, pulling out another case file. Normally, the weight of legal documents brought her comfort, grounding her in their structured logic. But now they felt like props in a play where she'd forgotten her lines. The words blurred before her eyes as her mind wandered to past battles. She remembered law school, when a professor had once suggested she might thrive better at a less prestigious institution. She thought of the countless times she'd been mistaken for a court clerk or a stenographer, whispers and doubts shadowing her journey all the way to the Supreme Court. Those moments had been clear-cut. She had paths forward to prove herself through hard work and knowledge. But here, in the artificial environment of an airplane cabin 7 miles above the ground, the usual rules didn't apply. The tools she normally used to combat prejudice felt out of reach. Another flight attendant, not Cheryl, approached with fresh drinks. Her smile was warm, her service professional. The genuine kindness starkly contrasted with Cheryl's earlier behavior, making it seem all the more glaring. Elena accepted a glass of water with quiet gratitude, savoring the moment of normalcy. The elderly woman across the aisle leaned over again. "I've been flying first class for 30 years, she whispered, her voice laced with both concern and quiet indignation. "I've never seen such unprofessional behavior." Elena gave her a soft smile. "Unfortunately, it's not as uncommon as you might think," she replied, the words spilling out before she could stop them. It was a rare moment of candor with a stranger. The woman's face fell, her understanding deepening. She looked away, clearly unsettled, as though re-evaluating years of unnoticed or ignored moments like this. Elena felt the weight of her achievements pressing down on her. In her courtroom, she could confront discrimination head-on. She could wield the power of law to correct wrongs and establish justice. But here, she felt strangely vulnerable. Her thoughts turned to her niece, who had recently started law school. What would she tell her about this moment? How would she explain that even at the pinnacle of her success, these battles hadn't disappeared? The thought left her chest tight, a blend of sorrow and determination. At the end of the aisle, Cheryl appeared again, now holding a garbage bag as she collected trash. Elena watched her approach, noticing how Cheryl's body language had shifted. Her movements were more rigid, her demeanor more defensive as she neared Elena's row. A memory of her mother surfaced, her voice strong and resolute. "Baby, sometimes the biggest statement you can make is staying exactly where you are, holding your head high." Her mother had said those words years ago, during the difficult days leading up to Elena's judicial appointment. Now, they felt as relevant as ever. Outside, the night sky stretched endlessly, dotted with stars that flickered faintly in the distance. Elena had spent countless childhood nights gazing at stars just like these, dreaming of a future where she could make a difference. She'd achieved those dreams, but Moments like this reminded her the work was far from over. Though the dinner service had ended, the tension lingered in the cabin like stale air. Elena tried to return her focus to the environmental case in front of her. But every time Cheryl passed by, she felt a subtle brush against her arm or shoulder, too deliberate to be accidental, yet too subtle to address outright. The water stain on her dress had mostly dried, leaving a faint mark, a quiet reminder of how quickly things could change. One moment she felt secure, comfortable in her skin. The next, she found herself questioning every choice, every right to occupy this space. She watched Cheryl interact with other passengers. With them, Cheryl was all smiles and efficiency, the perfect embodiment of airline hospitality. But when she reached Elena's row, her demeanor sharpened, her movements curt, her words clipped. The businessman next to Elena had dozed off, his laptop still open to a spreadsheet. Across the aisle, the elderly woman pretended to be engrossed in her novel, though Elena noticed how her eyes flicked up every time Cheryl walked by. Her disapproval was quiet but unmistakable. Another bump of Cheryl's hip against Elena's seat. Another fleeting, pointed glance at her dress. Each small act piled atop the last, creating a mountain of discomfort that was becoming harder to ignore. Elena shifted slightly, trying to make herself smaller. The instinct surprised her. It was something she thought she'd left behind long ago. In law school, she'd learned to take up space, to own her presence in rooms where people like her weren't always welcome. But here, in this confined space, that hard-earned confidence felt more fragile than ever. Justice Elena Grant stared at her phone, scrolling through photos she kept for moments like this, when she needed a reminder of who she was and what she stood for. There she was at her Supreme Court appointment ceremony, standing tall in her robes, making history. Another photo showed her delivering a commencement speech at her alma mater, inspiring a new generation of lawyers. The stark contrast between those triumphant moments and this humiliating encounter made her throat tighten. A young flight attendant approached her row, but this time it wasn't Cheryl. The name tag read Sophia, and her warm smile actually reached her eyes. "Can I get you anything else?" Sophia asked as she handed Elena a fresh glass of water. Her tone lacked any of the sharpness or condescension that Cheryl's carried. "No, thank you," Elena replied, grateful for this briefly unremarkable moment of normalcy. As Sophia moved down the aisle, Elena caught sight of Cheryl watching from the galley, her expression souring at the sight of her colleague's kindness. The contrast was striking, Sophia's simple humanity versus Cheryl's cold hostility. The cabin lights dimmed further as passengers settled in for sleep. Despite the calm atmosphere, Elena's mind raced, replaying every interaction with Cheryl, analyzing possible responses, weighing them against her years of experience handling prejudice. No solution seemed satisfying. Cheryl emerged from the galley again, holding a garbage bag. As she neared Elena's row, her movements became more deliberate, more pointed. This time she leaned unnecessarily close, letting the bag brush against Elena's face as she reached for trash from the window seat passenger. "Oh, sorry," Cheryl said, her insincere tone once again making her lack of apology abundantly clear. "These aisles are just so narrow." Several rows ahead, the young woman who had turned around earlier twisted in her seat once more. Her face showed clear disgust at Cheryl's behavior. She made eye contact with Elena, raising her eyebrows in a silent question. "Do you want me to say something?" Elena gave a small shake of her head. She appreciated the support, but this was her battle to fight, or not fight, on her own terms. She had learned long ago that the most powerful response to prejudice was often refusing to let it define you. And yet, each small action from Cheryl felt like a wave crashing against her composure, slowly wearing it down. Elena thought about all the times she'd presided over cases involving discrimination. From the bench, the lines always seemed so clear. But here, in this liminal space between ground and sky, the boundaries were blurred, the solutions less obvious. Across the aisle, the elderly woman snapped her book shut with authority. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice steady and commanding. "I believe you owe this lady an apology for your behavior." Cheryl's face flushed red, her composure faltering for the first time. "I'm just doing my job, ma'am," she said stiffly, her tone defensive. "If anyone's been inappropriate, it's not me." Her eyes flicked once more to Elena's dress, the implication as cutting as her words. Elena felt her pulse quicken. This was exactly the kind of confrontation she had been trying to avoid. Public apologies rarely led to genuine change. "It's fine," Elena said quietly, attempting to diffuse the tension. But as the words left her lips, she couldn't help but wonder. Is it really fine? Was letting these moments slide part of the larger problem? The businessman beside her stirred awake, blinking groggily as he took in the scene. "What's going on?" he asked, straightening in his seat. "Nothing that needs to concern you, sir," Cheryl said quickly, her professional mask slipping back into place. But the damage was done. More passengers were now paying attention. The bubble of first-class privacy had been pierced, and Elena could feel the weight of their eyes on her. In her courtroom, attention meant power, respect. Here it felt like exposure, like she was on trial for daring to exist in a space someone else had decided she didn't belong. She reached for her briefcase, needing something to ground her. Among the legal papers and case files, her fingers found a small photo of her grandmother. The older woman had always been a source of strength for Elena, teaching her to hold her head high no matter the circumstances. The flight entered its final hour, the cabin quieting as most passengers either dozed off or sank into their own routines. But Cheryl's presence brought an undercurrent of tension each time she passed Elena's row. Finally, Cheryl stopped beside her, her voice barely above a whisper, but sharp enough to cut through the hum of the engines. "Your dress is still obstructing the aisle," she said, her tone dripping with accusation. "You really should have dressed more appropriately for travel." Something shifted inside Elena. The weight of the evening, the quiet microaggressions, and the unrelenting scrutiny all reached a breaking point. Maybe it was exhaustion from holding her composure for so long, or perhaps it was the memory of her grandmother's photo tucked safely in her briefcase. Whatever it was, Justice Elena Grant felt a surge of familiar strength, an inner resolve that had carried her through countless trials in her career. "What exactly do you mean by appropriate?" Elena asked, her voice calm but firm. She turned to face Cheryl directly. Neither aggressive nor submissive, but with the quiet authority honed over years on the bench. Cheryl's posture stiffened, clearly caught off guard by the challenge. Her eyes darted around the cabin as if searching for an ally, but all she found were disapproving stares. The young woman who had been observing earlier sat up straighter, phone in hand, her expression intent as she focused on every word. "Well," Cheryl fumbled, her confidence wavering. "Just something more suitable for this section of the plane." The implications of her words were unmistakable, and the passengers within earshot exchanged glances. The elderly woman across the aisle closed her book with deliberate care and spoke up, her voice calm but cutting. "I'm wearing a designer dress too," she said, just loud enough for the cabin to hear. "Is mine also inappropriate? Or is there some other reason you're singling out this passenger?" Cheryl's face flushed deep red. "That's not. I didn't mean," she stammered, her words faltering as she shrank under the collective gaze of the cabin. Elena remained perfectly composed, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Years of presiding over tense courtroom situations had taught her the value of silence, how letting someone's words linger in the air could force them to confront their own weight. The businessman next to her cleared his throat. "I've been flying first class for 20 years, he said matter-of-factly. "I've seen passengers in everything from sweatpants to suits, and I've never once heard anyone question their clothing choices." More passengers were now tuning in, the quiet hum of the cabin replaced by soft murmurs of agreement. Cheryl's professional mask began to crumble as uncertainty crept into her expression. She seemed to realize she had lost control of the situation. "Perhaps," Elena said, her voice steady yet unyielding, "we should be clear about what's really happening here." She stood slowly, the deliberate motion allowing her to rise to her full height. The act alone was enough to make Cheryl take a small step back, her earlier confidence evaporating. Around them, the cabin grew quieter as passengers watched the scene unfold. "I am Justice Elena Grant of the Supreme Court," Elena said, each word measured and clear. "This dress was a gift from a dear friend, though I shouldn't have to explain that. My ticket was booked through official government channels, though that shouldn't matter either. What does matter is that I, like every other passenger on this flight, deserve to be treated with basic respect." The effect was immediate. Cheryl's face went pale, her eyes widening in recognition. Around the cabin, passengers exchanged looks, some nodding in approval, others looking embarrassed that they hadn't spoken up earlier. "I didn't," Cheryl stammered, her voice a whisper as her earlier superiority dissolved. "That's exactly the point," Elena said gently, but firmly. "You didn't know who I was, and yet you felt comfortable making assumptions and treating me with disrespect. Would knowing my title earlier have changed your behavior? And more importantly, should it have to?" The young woman from earlier raised her phone slightly. "I've been recording this," she said, her voice steady but resolute. "Not to cause trouble, but because someone needed to document how you've been treating her this entire flight." Cheryl's professional demeanor crumbled completely. "I never meant. I was just trying to maintain standards." Her words trailed off as the weight of her actions sank in, sounding hollow even to her. At that moment, Sophia, the kind flight attendant from earlier, appeared at Cheryl's side. "I'll take it from here," she said firmly, gently steering Cheryl toward the galley. Sophia turned to Elena, her tone apologetic. "Ma'am, on behalf of the airline, I sincerely apologize." Elena nodded, acknowledging the apology but keeping her expression neutral. She had seen enough performative regret in her courtroom to know that real change rarely came from public humiliation. As she sat back down, several passengers reached out in quiet solidarity. A soft pat on her arm, a whispered, "Well done," a nod of respect. The elderly woman across the aisle wiped a tear from her eye. "That," she said softly, "was long overdue." The plane began its descent, the subtle shift in cabin pressure signaling their return to Earth. Elena felt it in her ears, a reminder that she was leaving this space between ground and sky, where her title and position meant little. Soon, her role as Justice Grant would once again shield her from such blatant treatment. But for now, in this fragile, temporary space, she had won a different kind of victory. Not through her title or authority, but by reclaiming her dignity with quiet strength. Justice Elena Grant sat quietly, the weight of the confrontation settling over her like a heavy cloud. Despite the victory of standing up for her dignity, there was a familiar emptiness that often followed moments like this. Even in triumph, it stung to know that respect had only been granted after her title had been revealed, not because of her inherent humanity. She smoothed her dress absent-mindedly, her fingers brushing over the faint water stain that had dried into a barely visible mark. From the galley, she could hear hushed voices. Cheryl speaking with the lead flight attendant. While the words were inaudible, the tone conveyed urgency and unease. Sophia, the kind flight attendant, passed through the cabin again, offering apologetic smiles as if trying to reset the atmosphere. The young woman who had recorded the interaction still held her phone, her expression uncertain. She caught Elena's eye and silently mouthed, "Should I delete it?" Elena gave a slight shake of her head. Documentation, she knew, was sometimes necessary, even if she hoped it would never need to be used. The businessman beside her cleared his throat. "I've seen a lot of unprofessional behavior in my travels," he said quietly, his voice weighted with regret. "But this was something else entirely." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "I'm sorry I didn't speak up sooner." Elena turned to him with a gentle smile. "Sometimes," she said softly, "knowing when to speak up is as important as knowing what to say." Over the years, she'd learned that timing was everything when it came to matters of justice. The cabin lights brightened slightly as the plane began its final approach. The seatbelt sign dinged on, and passengers started gathering their belongings, the usual pre-landing routine, attempting to reassert itself. But this time, the energy felt different, subdued by the weight of what had transpired. Cheryl appeared one last time, her face tear-streaked and her hands trembling slightly. She stopped at the edge of Elena's row, her body language utterly transformed from the arrogance she had displayed earlier. "Justice Grant," she began, her voice barely audible. I don't know what to say." The entire cabin seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see how Elena would respond. She took her time, drawing on years of experience presiding over moments of reckoning. This, she realized, was another kind of courtroom. "Sometimes," Elena said finally, her voice gentle but firm. Our actions say more than our words ever could. She met Cheryl's gaze, not with anger, but with a steady look that demanded recognition of shared humanity. Today, your actions spoke volumes about assumptions that hurt, not just me, but our entire society. Cheryl's shoulders slumped as the weight of her behavior fully sank in. I never thought of myself as... She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Tears welled in her eyes, but Elena noticed they were tears of shame, not self-pity. The plane hit a patch of turbulence, causing passengers to grip their armrests. The physical jolts mirrored the emotional turbulence that had gripped the cabin for much of the flight. A child a few rows ahead asked their mother in a loud whisper, "Why is the flight attendant crying?" Elena's voice remained steady as she continued, speaking just loud enough for those nearby to hear. "I've spent my career fighting for justice, not just in grand dramatic cases, but in small, everyday moments like this. Because it's these moments that shape who we are as a society." The elderly woman across the aisle nodded silently, her eyes glistening with understanding. Elena realized that this woman had likely witnessed countless such moments in her lifetime, moments where prejudice revealed itself in quiet, cutting ways. Cheryl wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, her professional mask entirely stripped away. "I'll accept whatever consequences come from this," she said, her voice shaky but sincere. "I deserve to lose my job." "Perhaps," Elena replied, her tone thoughtful, "but losing a job won't solve the deeper issue. What matters is what you learn from this moment, how it changes the way you see and treat others." She had presided over too many cases where punishment alone failed to create real change. True transformation, she knew, required reflection and growth. As the plane began its final descent, the cabin pressure shifted, causing ears to pop. Outside the window, city lights twinkled against the dark expanse, a vivid reminder of the world they were returning to. A world where encounters like this played out daily, often without recognition or resolution. Sophia reappeared, gently guiding Cheryl back to the galley. The younger flight attendant's presence brought a renewed sense of professionalism to the cabin. Elena turned her gaze back to the window, her thoughts lingering on how even small moments like this could ripple outward, shaping perspectives and sparking change. As Cheryl walked away, muffled sobs escaped from the galley. The sound brought Elena Grant no satisfaction, only a profound weariness. It was a stark reminder of how much work remained to address the biases and assumptions ingrained in everyday interactions. The young woman with the phone finally tucked it away, her face thoughtful. "You know," she said, turning in her seat to face Elena, "I always wondered what I'd do if I saw something like this happen. Now I know. It's not just about speaking up. It's about understanding the cost of staying silent." Elena nodded, feeling the weight of her responsibility settle even deeper. She had carried that weight for years, both as a judge and as a woman determined to carve out space in rooms not built for her. The water stain on her dress had dried completely, leaving only a faint reminder of how the confrontation began. But Elena knew the impact of the incident would linger long after the physical mark had disappeared. The plane landed with a gentle bump, its wheels making solid contact with the runway. As they taxied to the gate, Elena caught her reflection in the darkened window. She appeared composed and dignified, but she knew she was somehow changed by the events of the past few hours. The seatbelt sign dinged off and the usual chaos of deplaning began. Yet this time, the atmosphere was different. Passengers weren't rushing to be the first off the plane. Instead, they moved with a quiet deliberation, as if they understood this moment required a more thoughtful conclusion. The elderly woman across the aisle rose slowly, gathering her belongings. She leaned toward Elena and spoke softly. "You know, I've been flying for over 40 years. I've never said anything when I saw things like this happen, always told myself it wasn't my place. Today taught me differently." Elena smiled, her expression tinged with both gratitude and encouragement. As passengers filed past, several paused at her row. A middle-aged woman touched her shoulder gently. "Thank you for handling that with such grace," she whispered. "My daughter's in law school, and I'm going to tell her about you." The businessman who had been seated beside her handed her his card. "If you ever need a witness statement about what happened here," he said firmly, "don't hesitate to call." His expression carried genuine concern, mixed with a newfound awareness of privileges he may have taken for granted. At the front of the plane, Cheryl was nowhere to be seen. Instead, Sophia stood by the exit, offering sincere smiles to each passenger as they disembarked. When Alina finally rose to leave, Sophia stepped forward. "The airline manager is waiting at the gate," she said softly. "But more importantly, I want you to know that not all of us." She trailed off, emotion thickening her voice. Elena touched Sophia's arm gently. "I know," she said simply. Throughout her career, she had learned to recognize allies as surely as she identified prejudice. Sophia's kindness throughout the flight had not gone unnoticed. The young woman with the phone lingered by the exit. "I have the video if you need it," she said, her voice steady with conviction. "What happened wasn't right, and there should be consequences." As Elena stepped into the jet bridge, she saw the airline manager waiting, his expression a carefully crafted blend of concern and professionalism. Behind him stood Cheryl, her eyes red and swollen, her posture smaller under the harsh airport lighting. "Justice Grant," the manager began, his tone deferential, "we want to express our deepest apologies for your experience today. This is not representative of our airline's values or standards." Elena held up her hand, silencing his practiced speech. "What I'd like," she said firmly, "is not just an apology, but action. Your airline needs comprehensive diversity and sensitivity training, not as punishment, but as an opportunity for growth." The manager blinked, clearly unprepared for such a constructive response. He had likely expected demands for compensation or threats of legal action. Instead, Elena was offering a path forward, one that required accountability and change. Cheryl stepped forward, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "I know sorry isn't enough," she said, her voice barely audible above the airport's ambient noise. "But I want you to know that I see now what I did, really see it, and I'm ashamed." Elena studied her carefully. Over her years on the bench, she had seen many people face the consequences of their actions. Some demonstrated genuine remorse, others simply regretted being caught. Cheryl's shame seemed real. But the true test would be what she did with it. "Use this feeling," Elena said quietly. "Let it change how you see and treat others. That's the only apology I'm interested in." She turned back to the manager. "I expect to hear about changes in your training programs," she added. "My office will follow up." Passengers continued filing past, some nodding in support or offering small smiles of encouragement. The young woman with the phone hesitated, still clutching it uncertainly. "Keep it," Elena told her. "But maybe, instead of using it to punish, use it to teach. Sometimes seeing ourselves through someone else's eyes is the strongest wake-up call." As Elena walked away, the faint buzz of the airport surrounded her, a blend of hurried announcements, rolling luggage, and the shuffle of weary travelers. The weight of the experience lingered, but so did a sense of purpose. Change, she knew, didn't come easily or quickly. But every step, no matter how small, pushed the world closer to justice. And today, she had taken one of those steps. The airport buzzed with its usual energy, travelers rushing to make connections, families reuniting with tearful hugs, and business people striding purposefully toward meetings. Justice Elena Grant felt herself sliding back into her familiar role, her professional armor settling comfortably into place after the turbulent events of the flight. The elderly woman from the plane appeared one last time, gently touching Elena's arm. "You've taught more than just Cheryl today," she said softly. "You've taught all of us something about dignity and justice. Thank you for that." Elena's heels clicked against the smooth terminal floor as she made her way toward the exit, the sound echoing beneath the high ceilings. Her briefcase felt heavier now, as though the legal documents inside carried a new, deeper significance. Her phone buzzed. A message from her clerk reminding her of tomorrow's hearings. The mundane notification felt almost jarring after the emotional weight of the past few hours. How strange, Elena thought, that while she had been confronting discrimination at 30,000 feet, the machinery of justice had continued running smoothly on the ground. She paused at a large window overlooking the runway, watching planes take off and land in the darkness. Somewhere out there, Cheryl was likely beginning her journey home, carrying the weight of their encounter with her. Elena hoped it would lead to genuine change, not just in Cheryl's behavior, but in her understanding of the world. Maya, the young woman from the flight, had introduced herself before leaving. "I'll send the video to your office," she'd promised. Not as evidence for punishment, but as a teaching tool. People need to see how these things happen, how they build up from small moments into something much bigger. Elena's thoughts turned to her years on the bench, ruling on cases involving discrimination. How often had she heard lawyers argue about intent and impact, attempting to quantify harm in legal terms? Today's experience had reminded her that the real damage often came from the accumulation of small cuts, the looks, the assumptions, the quiet dismissals that wore away at someone's sense of belonging. A group of flight attendants passed by, their uniforms crisp and professional. Elena found herself wondering about their stories, their experiences. How many of them had witnessed situations like today's? How many had stayed silent, unsure of how to intervene? A reflection in the glass caught her attention. The water stain on her dress had faded, now barely visible unless you knew where to look. Like so many marks left by prejudice, it would disappear with time but remain imprinted in her memory. Outside the airport, the cool night air felt refreshing against her face, a stark contrast to the confined tension of the plane. Her driver stood waiting, ready to take her home, but Elena lingered for a moment, savoring the freedom of open space. The elderly woman's words echoed in her mind. "You've taught all of us something about dignity and justice." Justice. It hadn't been her intention when she boarded the flight, but perhaps the unplanned lessons were often the most profound. Elena had spent her career shaping laws that protected people's rights, writing opinions that would guide future generations of judges. But today's events had reminded her that justice wasn't confined to courtrooms or legal documents. It lived in everyday moments, in small, quiet stands against prejudice and the courage to speak up when silence would have been easier. Tomorrow, she would return to her chambers, don her robes, and resume her role in the formal justice system. But she would carry this experience with her, letting it inform her understanding of the cases that came before her. Sometimes, the most important perspective wasn't found in legal precedent, but in lived experience. The driver opened the car door, and Elena slid into the familiar leather seat. As the car pulled away from the airport, she gazed out the window, watching planes continue their endless cycle of takeoffs and landings. Somewhere up there, other battles were unfolding, other assumptions being challenged, and other lessons being learned. Elena pulled out her phone and began typing notes for an upcoming speaking engagement at a law school. She had a new story to share now, a personal testament to how justice and injustice could appear in the most unexpected places. Maybe her experience would help future lawyers see that their role wasn't just to argue cases, but to recognize and challenge prejudice in all its forms. The city lights blurred past her window as the car drove on, each one a reminder of countless lives intersecting in ways both meaningful and mundane. Elena thought of Cheryl, of Maya, of the elderly woman and the businessman. How a few hours on a plane had connected their stories and perhaps, just perhaps, shifted their perspectives. Her hand brushed against her briefcase, its familiar weight a comfort. Inside it were the tools of her profession: case files, legal texts, and neatly organized notes. But tonight, Elena carried something more intangible. A renewed understanding that justice wasn't just a goal to strive for in her courtroom, but a practice to be lived out in the world, one small stand at a time. Elena Grant's briefcase sat heavy on the seat beside her, filled with law books, case files, and meticulously prepared notes. These were the familiar tools of her trade, the instruments she used daily to uphold justice. But today had reminded her that sometimes the most powerful tool wasn't a legal precedent or a finely tuned argument. It was simply the courage to be herself, to stand her ground with dignity, and to transform moments of prejudice into opportunities for growth. As her house came into view, Elena felt a renewed sense of purpose settle over her. Tomorrow would bring new cases, fresh challenges, and countless opportunities to shape the law. But today had taught her something no law book ever could. Justice wasn't just an abstract concept to be debated in courtrooms. It was a living, breathing force that needed nurturing in every interaction, every moment, and every choice, to stand up or stay silent. In that moment, Alina realized she was more than a Supreme Court justice. She was a witness to the ongoing struggle for dignity and respect, a participant in the daily work of building a more just world. And somehow that felt like the most important title she had ever held.